Much for being here. My name is Andrew Feinstein. I dislike sitting when I talk, but I'm just thinking, for the sake of your camera, maybe it's not a bad idea.
It's all right.
Is it all right?
You can move.
Okay. I had a terrible experience. I was an ANC member of Parliament in South Africa for a while, which is part of how I came to investigate the arms trade. And very soon after we were elected to Parliament, a small delegation from the ANC was sent to Atlanta, Georgia, our first official visit to the US, home of Martin Luther King Jr. and his widow, but also, as I discovered, the home not just of CNN, but of the Coca-Cola Corporation. So we arrived at the airport in Atlanta, and the mayor of Atlanta was there to welcome us, because it was literally a few weeks after our first democratic election. And he was a former professional basketball player who, to someone of my height, looked about 7'10". And he welcomed us from behind a lectern that was an illuminated Coke can. So after he'd said a few words, the person I was traveling with, who was the premier of our sort of economically most important province, a chap called Tokyo Sahwala, said to me, "Andrew, I'm tired. Won't you just go up and respond?" So I said, "Sure." So I walked up around the steps of this illuminated Coke can, and I said a few words, and I walked back down, and I went to Tokyo, who I didn't know very well, and I said to him, "Chief, was that all right?" So he said, "What you said was fine. It's just a pity that all we could see was an incredibly sweaty, bald head sticking out of a Coke can." So I sort of have an aversion to being behind anything when I speak. By way of introduction, I sometimes think, someone said to me the other day, I was giving a talk after we'd shown the film of Shadowwood. How many of you saw it last night, by the way? Just so I know, so I won't make references. Okay, fine. Somebody said, "Well, your life is basically 3 books and a film." And I thought, well, there's a positive way of looking at that and there's a rather reductionist way of looking at it. But in some ways, that's true. So my first book was a book called After the Party, which was about my experience as an ANC Member of Parliament. I joined the ANC in the mid-'80s in South Africa, where I was working in a squatter settlement just outside Cape Town, when it was still a banned organization. And landed up, much to my surprise, like all of us in that first democratic parliament, as a Member of Parliament under Mandela, and ran the Public Accounts Committee, the main financial oversight committee. And a report came to our committee about the fact that as Mandela was retiring, Thabo Mbeki, his successor, decided to spend $10 billion on weapons. Now, this is a society that has very limited fiscal resources at this point in our history, that has major social problems, and that doesn't have an enemy on the planet. Besides a few crazy extreme right-wingers who'd all basically gone back to the pub to drink beer after they tried to invade one of the tiny little so-called black homelands of the apartheid era and were driven back by the security forces of that little homeland, they realized that the game was out. So besides those guys who were so drunk most of their lives, South Africa literally did not have an enemy on the planet. I mean, maybe Nelson Mandela's ex-wife Winnie wasn't that keen on him, but other than that. But we spent $10 billion on weapons. And this was at the time that Thabo Mbeki, our then president, was claiming we did not have the fiscal resources to provide antiretroviral medication for the 6 million South Africans living with HIV or AIDS. So, according to a very conservative study conducted by Harvard University, the School of Public Health, at the Kennedy School of Government, over the 5 years after that policy decision, around 65,000 South Africans died avoidable deaths, and around 50,000 babies a year were born HIV positive because we couldn't afford mother-to-child transmission treatment. Now that, to me, sitting there as an MP, and this is my government doing this, I suppose put the choice in a very stark light and made me realize, first of all, that corruption is not a victimless crime, that the opportunity costs at so many levels of the global trade in weapons is gargantuan, and we often overlook that. So the ANC tried to stop me and my committee investigating this arms deal because of all the bribes that had been paid to serving cabinet ministers, to senior officials, to senior military leaders, to senior executives, and to my party itself. When I was re-elected in 1999, I didn't realize at the time, but our election campaign was funded by bribes from that arms deal. To give you one example, British Aerospace, the company that Prime Minister after Prime Minister describes as the jewel in the industrial and manufacturing crown of Great Britain, entered the tender to provide new jet fighters. They didn't make a shortlist of 3 because their offering didn't meet a whole lot of the technical specifications, was over-specced in some respects, and was 2.5 times more expensive than the aircraft that the South African Air Force actually wanted. So the defense minister, who had already done a corrupt deal with BAE Systems, was furious and insisted that the technical committee draw up a shortlist of 4, which included BAE. And that's what they did. But 4th place on the shortlist wasn't going to get them the contract. So in the middle of this procurement process, on the most expensive single contract yet entered into by the Democratic South Africa until today, he decided to exclude cost as a procurement criteria. So BAE went up to 2nd. In order to get them to 1st, he finagled further, and he increased the weighting of a nonsense called economic or industrial offsets, in terms of which basically arms companies say to you, if you buy £100 of our weaponry, we'll invest 120 or 150 or 200 pounds in your economy, which is really just a reason for politicians to justify buying arms that they don't need, and is a mechanism whereby huge numbers of the bribes are paid. Why am I focusing so much on the bribes and the corruption? Because the global trade in arms accounts for fully 40% of all corruption in all global trade. 40%. This is a figure developed by someone called Joe Rober at Transparency International. When the US Department of Commerce decided to investigate 5 years of corrupt transactions by American companies outside of the United States, 53% of those transactions were in the defense sector. And then, of course, there's the consequence of what these weapons do. They often make conflicts more bloody. They often elongate the time of the conflicts. And as we try and show in the film, in some instances, they even initiate conflict. Why? Because this is bloody good business for everyone involved. Not only do they make huge amounts of money out of it, but politically, it is the one thing that politicians, regardless of how incompetent and mediocre, as we are seeing both in this country and the United States of America at the moment, it's the one thing they can use to try and make themselves appear like leaders. So if Donald Trump could actually put on his pants the right way around, I'd be astonished. But he bombs a Syrian airfield, and his popularity ratings go up. He screams and shouts about the Iran nuclear deal, one of the few good things on national security that President Obama actually did, and his ratings go up. Everything else is forcing his ratings down. Think back to Margaret Thatcher. Did we actually need to go to war in the Falklands? Oh no, we did. We did, because you forget something very important. Her popularity ratings were plummeting. Her survival, her ability to follow through with an extreme neoliberal agenda was actually dependent on the popularity she generated as a consequence of the defense of the crucial Falkland Islands. Tony Blair? Claire Short says, having served with him in cabinet, that he was an inveterate arms dealer. She has no idea why, but he never saw an arms deal that he didn't like. He loved the drama, he loved the acting, he loved pretending to be a war hero. Had he ever served in uniform? No. Talk to people who actually fight wars, and the vast majority of them would like to see an end to war. Talk to the majority of the politicians who engender warfare and send people to die, and they think war is the greatest game they've discovered. And that's the reality of the world we live in today. And Britain's role in it is particularly pernicious for a number of reasons. First of all, and I apologize for saying this as a non-British person because I sometimes feel a little out of place doing so. In international relations, this country, since the collapse of empire, which was an extremely good thing, the collapse of empire, has been a complete non-player in international affairs with one exception. Its role as the poodle of the United States of America. So Tony Blair's enabling George W. Bush to invade Iraq without a UN resolution just made it a bit easier for the Americans. Our complete fixation with the nonsense that is the war on terror does what Edward Said, the Palestinian academic and activist, used to describe as power repeating untruths until it has the force of truth. There are honestly people in this world today who believe that the war on terror, so-called, is making us safer. Well, let me tell you from an arms trade perspective just how safe it's making us. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia beheads more human beings every year than ISIS, ISIL, and all the various formations of Al-Qaeda combined. Most of those beheadings take place in public with audiences. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is one of the most human rights abusing regimes on the planet, according to Amnesty International, and has been for the last 3 decades. But between ourselves and the United States of America, we keep the Saudi royal family in power. But what else does the Saudi royal family do? It promotes a form of Islam called Wahhabism that is at the root of the creation of what are called Islamic extremist movements. In addition to which, there is a deal between the Saudis and many so-called Islamic extremists, many of whom, like the bin Laden family, are from Saudi Arabia itself. And that is, well, we continue to support you. You don't attack us. You let us remain in power in Saudi Arabia. So we can continue to lead a lifestyle in which, for instance, to procure one contract, BAE developed a slush fund of £178 million of your money that it used to procure prostitutes, yachts, alcohol, gambling chips, and hard drugs, amongst other things, for members of the Saudi royal family. They then proceeded to pay £6 billion, that's with a B, in bribes on this Al-Yamamah deal. £6 billion of bribes, including just over £1 billion to Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who at the time was the Saudi ambassador to Washington, D.C. He also happened to be the son of the Saudi defense minister at the time. And no authorities in the United Kingdom, certainly, or the United States, had any interest in these bribes. And in fact, BAE Systems gave Prince Bandar as a birthday gift, in case the over £1 billion wasn't enough, an Airbus jet painted in the colors of his favorite American football team, the Dallas Cowboys. And you'll be delighted to know as British taxpayers that at least until 2007, and possibly still until today, we don't have the evidence from 2007, you and I have paid for the running, maintenance, and upkeep of Prince Bandar's little gift. US authorities only became interested in those bribes when they discovered that some of the £1 billion had gone from the accounts of Prince Bandar held in Riggs Bank opposite the White House in Washington, D.C., into the accounts of his wife, and inadvertently, said the Prince and Princess Bandar, into the accounts of 2 of the 9/11 hijackers. Which is why when Jeremy Corbyn said, after the tragic events in Manchester and on London Bridge during the recent election, to understand why these attacks are happening to us, we need to understand the role of the British arms trade in the world. Because we provide, along with America, virtually all of Saudi Arabia's weapons. We need to understand our relationship with Saudi Arabia, and we need to understand the impact that our foreign policy has on causing these sorts of attacks. So, if anybody suggests to me that the war on terror is making us safer, or that we need to continue the manufacture and trading of weaponry because it is making us more secure, my response would be that it's doing exactly the opposite. We are effectively shooting ourselves in the foot, the leg, the stomach, the heart, the arms, and unfortunately the head. But at least it's with our own weapons and bullets, even if we're not using them. Because that is the true nature of the global trade in weapons, unfortunately. But what else is it doing? It is ensuring that whenever there is conflict, our go-to solution is a military one. So, diplomacy is something that we really don't think a great deal of. Let me give you just one example. The United States employs, this is the government, employs more people to run one aircraft carrier than it has diplomats across the entire world. Today, the United States of America has 11 aircraft carriers. So how does that work? Well, the companies who make the aircraft carriers, amongst other things, circulate the money. So historically, the biggest contributors to political campaigns in the United States have been the defense contractors. And because the United States is a transparent society of what I describe as legalized bribery, we can actually trace the money that goes from a company to representatives in Congress and the projects that those representatives give back to those companies. It's a quid pro quo, and it's there for all to see. I documented in excruciating detail in this book, with references to all of the contracts and to all of the campaign contributions linked to them. Oh, but that's the United States of America, where 84% of retiring generals from the Pentagon go into senior executive positions with defense companies to whom they gave contracts during their time in the Pentagon. That could never happen in Britain. The so-called revolving door, the movement of people between government in its various forms and these defense companies and vice versa, is getting as bad in the United Kingdom as it is in the United States. There's one fundamental difference. There's more transparency in the United States than it is here, which is why Tony Blair says his greatest mistake in political life was the Freedom of Information Act. And that's a key feature of the global trade in weapons. The fact that everything that happens in this trade, which is why before Shadow World, the previous book on the global arms trade had been published in 1979 by a brilliant British writer called Anthony Sampson, a book called The Arms Bazaar. And what I wanted to do was write the updated Arms Bazaar, but unfortunately, because it was 2011 rather than 1979, there had to be almost 3,000 footnotes in the book to get it published. So, the trade is exceptional in that the companies and governments are incredibly, incredibly close. This intertwining. And it's both at formal and informal levels. It is a part of national security and national defense, so they're therefore regarded as strategic industries, regardless of their economic necessity. But crucially, everything that happens in this trade happens behind a veil of national security-imposed secrecy, so that the politicians, the corporate executives, officials in the Ministry of Defense, the Foreign Commonwealth Office, officials in our intelligence agencies, believe that what they do in these deals will not be exposed in the public realm. And the reality is that it very seldom is. What I've got in the book is a fraction, a tiny fraction of the arms deals that have taken place. But they are the ones that we happen to have been able to get documentary evidence of, or at least of the malfeasance in them. So, this veil of secrecy is used to hide what is supposed to be strategic pieces of information that is needed to defend ourselves. But at the same time, they hide the billions of pounds of bribes that we are paying. So how do we feel about the fact that we are propagating this industry around the world, often to the countries that can least afford it? Tony Blair sold an air traffic radar system to Tanzania for $45 million, $15 million of bribes, when they did not have one military aircraft that was fit to fly. And the country had been offered for $5 million a civilian air traffic radar control system, which is what they needed to boost their tourism industry. But there weren't $15 million of bribes on offer from the UN. So Tony Blair and BAE won the contract instead. Oh, but besides making us safer, this industry is essential to our economy. It is a very small fraction of the British economy, first of all. But second of all, and white South Africans of my generation studied for far too long, because it was the only way to stay out of the apartheid army. So in addition to a few degrees in clinical psychology, I have a few degrees in economics as well. And it's amazing when you start collating the information, the economic information from around the world, as we've done in our latest book, a smaller book called Indefensible, 7 Myths That Sustain the Global Arms Trade. And this you can read for free online at a website called projectindefensible.org, I think it is. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's .org. Where we put together some of that economic information to show that often the nature of this industry and the extent of the public, the state subsidies of the industry, actually cause it to be a drag on economic growth. But in addition to which, and most crucially, it is an appalling way to create employment. Why? Because there is such extreme public subsidy and investment in the industry that the cost of each of those jobs to you and I, so we're told that BAE is of great benefit to our economy, but it's our taxes that are sustaining BAE. And the cost of each job could create between 3 and 7 equivalent jobs in far more productive and socially beneficial sectors of our economy, including, most obviously, renewable energy. Now, this is work that has been done by 3 different academic institutions in the United States, and by 2 academic institutions in the United Kingdom. But oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. When we were told that Tony Blair was closing down a 5.5-year investigation into the £6 billion of bribes paid by BAE Systems to the Saudis on the Al Yamamah deal, we were told that if we didn't close down the investigation, the Saudis wouldn't buy our Typhoon jets, and 55,000 people in this country would be put out of work. Well, actually, when Paul Dunn, a defense economist at the University of the West of England, did the numbers, there were about 5,500 direct and indirect jobs in the United Kingdom that were dependent on the Typhoon contract. But it's okay, because we emblazoned the 55,000 figure on black cabs all over London. This industry is one of deceit. It is the same sort of deceit that is the stock in trade of our tawdry politics in the world today. You know, Barack Obama as a candidate said, what is so sad is the smallness of our politics in relation to the vastness of our challenges. When he came into office, he decided, so we'll give him the benefit of the doubt, that new ethical guidelines were required for the procurement of weaponry within the United States itself. So he introduced those new guidelines. There would be a 2-year hiatus between anybody leaving government or the defense contractors and joining the other. So in other words, trying to slow the revolving door. Then it took him a few weeks to violate his own new ethical guidelines when he appointed as Secretary of the Air Force a 28-year veteran at Lockheed Martin who came straight from the Lockheed boardroom into the Pentagon. And I think, again, giving him the benefit of the doubt, that he realized the military-industrial congressional complex, as Eisenhower originally wanted to call it, was just too powerful and too strong to take on. And for his second re-election campaign, he was very happy to take a lot of money from the defense contractors who realized they could live with him, because he was happy to let the F-35, what I refer to as the trillion-dollar turkey, a jet fighter that is costing the American taxpayer $1.5 trillion, that Pierce Spray, a former aerospace design engineer in the Pentagon, describes, and I'm paraphrasing him a little bit, the biggest piece of crap built by a company, Lockheed Martin, that specializes in crap. He says the best thing about this jet is that the only people who are going to be endangered by it are the test pilots. But that spend goes on. Of course, Donald Trump said he was going to close it down because it was a waste of money. Has he done anything of the sort? Of course not. And has increased the military budget by $58 billion. So, post-Brexit in this country, what is our industrial strategy? To export more and more arms to anyone on the planet who will buy them. Whether they're democratic, whether they're autocratic, whether they're involved in conflicts, whether they're peaceable, whether they cut the heads off of their own citizens and others, as long as they can pay us. And what are the consequences of that? The consequences are that since March of 2015, a minimum of 5,113 innocent civilians in Yemen have been bombed to death. Why? Because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time and they were collateral damage to the Saudi-led coalition's air war that is fueled by British and American jets, bombs, and missiles? No, because they were consciously targeted civilians, innocent civilians. 1/3, according to the United Nations, 1/3 of the Saudi-led coalition's targets have intentionally been civilian. Intentionally been civilian. And not only do we sell them the weapons, But our advisors, along with American advisors, are supposedly advising them on targeting. So we're actually complicit not just in violations of international humanitarian law, but we are also complicit in war crimes. But the High Court in London recently judged that British arms sales to Saudi Arabia are legal and legitimate. Why? Not that they don't violate British law, the European Common Position on Arms Exports, and the International Arms Trade Treaty, all of which the United Kingdom claims to have championed. No. Because our system of arms export control in this country is rigorous, robust, and effective. Tell that to the celebrants at a wedding in Yemen who were bombed to death. Tell that to the 365,000 South Africans who died avoidable deaths because of the bribes that Tony Blair and BAE Systems paid to South Africa's corrupt politicians. Because that is the reality of Britain's role in the arms trade. And none of us can escape it. Which leads me finally to the question of what do we do? We can do nothing. Which is what we do about most things in the world today. We sit in front of our televisions and we gorge shit food. That's basically what we do about most things in the world today. We'll have the conversation if you don't agree. We can do something about it. And we can start small. We can start by saying, shouldn't we perhaps be protesting, be engaging in direct action at the BAE factory near Edinburgh? Shouldn't we be making our feelings known at the Celex factory that provides components for radar systems that go into some of these jets that is in the north of Edinburgh? Shouldn't we at least be informing other people about this information that is actually in the public domain? That's where we start. Where do we end? We possibly end by saying, do we want this to be done with our tax pounds in our name? Or do we, like a small component of the Veterans for Peace in the United States, want to calculate the percentage of every pound that we pay in tax that goes to BAE Systems, to Rolls-Royce, to Kinetic, and to other defense manufacturers in this country? And like those veterans who have experienced the reality of war, we rather take that percentage, which in the United States is 30 cents in every dollar, and we put it into a peace fund. And we pay our taxes, because a society needs taxes to function in the interests of all in that society. But we withhold that money that goes towards the building of weapons and the propagation of war. So there's a great deal we can do. As Margaret Mead, the not uncontroversial American anthropologist, said, she basically spent her life very politely giving the finger to a society reflected in her father, who said to her in her teen years, there's no reason for you to carry on at school. You just need to find a husband. So her very polite way of giving him the finger was to become the first woman to get a PhD at Harvard University. And towards the end of her career, she said, never forget that history is changed by the actions of small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens. It has always been the case, and it always will be. And I'm not sure that I would have believed that as I was having to leave South Africa to avoid military service in the mid-1980s. And I drove up a road called Chapman's Peak Drive to look over Cape Town for what I thought would be the last time because nobody saw an end to apartheid imminently. If someone had told me then, no, don't worry, in less than 8 years, the ANC would be in government, Nelson Mandela would be president, and you'd be back in the country of your birth, I would have used my training in clinical psychology and suggested they seek help. But that is what happened. Change does happen. But it requires ordinary people to want to bring about change and to do things to bring about that change. I'll stop there.